What's up everyone, it's Dakota, and welcome back to another modern video, and today we are going to be kind of updating the Rakdos mid-range kind of guide that I had made, I think last year, and I think it's important to kind of revisit this deck, mainly because at the time that I recorded that video, Rakdos mid-range was not necessarily a deck that people played as much as it is played now. I mean, it is the by far and away the most played deck in the modern format. So I think having a place to kind of have a nice beginner's guide, give yourself a good base, or maybe even if you're just trying to learn the modern format, learn about the deck, get some additional information and stuff. I think this would be a good place to start. Kind of your adventure either to getting into the deck or just trying to figure out what makes it tick, maybe some key cards and things like that. So, of course, before we get too deep into it, if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more stuff like this, more modern content, Pioneer, all that fun stuff, please be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. There's a link down in the description below to Discord server too. I'd really appreciate it if you follow that link and go ahead and join over there so we can talk about Magic and really just anything else. I like talking to people. Put that on a t-shirt. Rakdos midrange is Rakdos Evoke slash scam slash a million different nicknames for honestly a pretty basic archetype of just Magic in general. So the main game plan and like the idea behind this deck and what makes it so powerful is getting to evoke this card called Grief, which when it enters the battlefield, an opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card. To pay the evoke, you exile a black card from your hand, and essentially when it enters the battlefield, it will have an evoke trigger go on the stack, which when that trigger resolves, it will sacrifice the Grief. The way that we get around this, and we get to essentially keep this card around for free on turn 1, is with cards like Not Dead After All and Undying Evil. We're going to look at Not Dead After All because it'll explain like why Undying Evil has now come back into, come back into this archetype after initially being in it and then kind of just pushed off to the side. So Not Dead After All basically gives when target creature you control gains when this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to it. The Wicked Roll attached to it gives it +1/+1, and then when this aura is put into a graveyard, each opponent loses a life. So it is an upgrade, albeit in the very slightest way, an upgrade to some of the other Undying effects that we have seen in this deck. So instead of getting a counter, it just gets an aura attached to it that if it happens to go to the graveyard, your opponent loses a life. More than likely it will if they get rid of the creature, so it drains them. And unfortunately, I was on the receiving end of this one loss of life actually mattering. So while I say it is an upgrade, it's not like an upgrade in the sense that now this deck is, infinitely better, or, it's like miles ahead of like the other ones. It's just a little bit better, which, makes it good enough to be played in this deck and be the main way that we are getting these evoke creatures back. There's also Undying Evil. Gives a creature undying until end of turn, which means that if it had no +1/+1 counters on it when it died, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter. You wouldn't see this card because the other undying effects would put a +1/+1 counter on those creatures, which essentially would mean that other copies of Undying Evil would not work on those creatures because they already had +1/+1 counters on them. Now that you just have something that is essentially putting an aura on these evoke creatures or on these other creatures in general, Undying Evil works in getting to do it, and you're only playing 2 copies, so chances are that you Undying Evil something and then immediately want to Undying Evil that same thing again, is, pretty low. So, you could just end up playing like some of the other ones, but Undying Evil seems to be the preference for now. Of course, you can do the same thing with Fury, deal 4 damage to something, and then, put the Evoke trigger on the stack, play a Not Dead After All, Undying Evil on it, comes back, and ends up really just wrecking your opponent's board. Of course, Grief being the better of the two, simply for the fact that if your opponent doesn't have any interaction or has to have like 2 pieces of interaction, usually on turn 0, which is basically impossible. You know, like they could have something like Solitude Pitch, but then they're going down 3 cards and you went down 2 cards. I would still say that you're pretty ahead in that exchange given some of the other powerful cards that this deck plays. So while that is the main game plan, you're trying to put a Grief or a Fury into play on turn 1, mainly a Grief because you can actually take away your opponent's interaction and scam them out of playing an actual game of Magic, hence why you'll hear people call this deck Rakdos Scam. However, when you don't have plays like that where you just get to Grief or Fury on turn 1, the deck does play like a pretty good mid-range deck, in all honesty, by getting to play some very powerful cards that synergize well together and also kind of feed into, you know, the Not Dead After Alls and the Undying Evils, where like even playing it on some of these other creatures isn't like necessarily the worst thing. So starting off, we have Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. We're going to go through creatures and we're going to just work down the list. Ragavan, even in a format with Orcish Bowmaster, in a format with Ren and 6, in a format with, you know, a bunch of just 1 mana removal, you know, the options for 0 mana removal, so on and so on, Ragavan is still played at a very high rate. Like, that just tells you how powerful this card is. The fact that it connects, you're going to start getting a mana advantage. You're going to be able to get cards from your opponent's library. Maybe you can eventually cast some of those cards. It has dash, so you can kind of like run and gun with a Ragavan if you so choose to get around some of the sorcery speed removal in the format. I mean, it's just, this card is amazing. And, you know, when Bowmasters came out, you know, it's like, is it going to dethrone Ragavan? Like, what's going to happen? And while definitely Bowmasters arguably is one of the best cards against Ragavan, Ragavan is still in its own right very powerful, and so powerful that it warrants playing a 4 of in the Rakdos deck, which is just insane and speaks to how powerful it is against the decks that don't necessarily have that early interaction to deal with it, and that even in a format where, you know, the deck that is played the most, you know, 17-18%, is playing a full 4 copies of Bowmaster, and then the next most played deck is playing like a full 4 copies of Ren and 6, and Ragavan is still a 4 of in, you know, those red decks, is a testament to how good it is. And you can't really sing its praises high enough. It is still one of the best creatures in Modern, period, on top of probably being one of the best 1-drops to be playing in Modern right now. Moving on, you have Dauthi Voidwalker, which is essentially a Leyline of the Void on legs. It is a 2 double black and for a 3/2 with Shadow, which says that it can't block. It can block or be blocked by only creatures with Shadow. So opposing Dauthi Voidwalkers can block each other. Dauthi Voidwalker cannot block like Ragavan or anything like that. Unfortunate, but it is what it is. But the flip side of that, if a card would be put into opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile that card instead with a Void counter on it. And you can sacrifice Dauthi Voidwalker, choose an exile card with a Void counter on it, and then play it this turn without paying its mana cost. So you can basically play this and, you know, be like a hate piece. Of course, we saw from Pro Tour Lord of the Rings, you know, a few months ago, where you play a Dauthi Voidwalker and then you could like grief your opponent. And if you're playing something that's like Tron, you can end up like taking their big Ulamog and just firmly setting them back. On top of this, Dauthi Voidwalker does have some synergy with Not Dead After All and Undying Evil. Specifically, Not Dead After All just being just a hair better, you know, like I said, kind of in the intro of this. So you can cast a Not Dead After All on a Dauthi Voidwalker. You can then sack the Dauthi Voidwalker to play a spell, and since the Dauthi Voidwalker died, it can come back into play with that Wicked Roll attached to it, and casting, you know, one of your opponent's spells, like a Crashing Footfalls or, you know, a Karn or something like that. And then on the next turn, you can essentially do the same thing over again, and of course drain your opponent for a life, you know, as like an extra benefit, but essentially getting to double up on Voidwalker activations while also getting to maintain, you know, essentially the Leyline of the Void, you know, text that is on the card. So really neat. Definitely has a little bit of synergy. Of course, allows you to be aggressive in those matchups where you need to be aggressive. 3 mana 3/2 is above rate, and your opponent can't necessarily just get in front and block it. Usually like Bowmaster and stuff, you can kind of trade up for like those 2 toughness creatures, and Dauthi Voidwalker is one that your opponents really can't easily deal with an Orcish Bowmaster. I mean, they can attempt to race it at some point, but even then you're kind of outpacing the Bowmasters in that sense. So Voidwalker sneakily one of the best creatures in this deck. I mean, I think it's probably like the third best creature, probably the third best creature in this deck that you are actually wanting to play for its actual cost. But that said, you know, the utility that it offers, the little tricks and stuff that you can do to kind of maximize your value for a Voidwalker, and as a way to like kind of turn the corner and, you know, kind of get in like unblockable damage when, you know, you absolutely just need those last few points when your opponent finally, you know, maybe gets to deal with your Grief or Fury, ends up being pretty valuable. And usually when you're sacrificing it, it's because like getting in, you know, 3, potentially 6 points of damage is not worth, you know, the spell that you're getting to cast from the Voidwalker, especially if you can just bring it back, like I said, with the Not Dead After All and the Undying Evil. You have Kroxa. The way this deck like operates, I mean, you're essentially just like wanting to be as mana efficient as possible, play as many spells as you can, as efficiently as you can, to eventually get ahead and get the advantage back in your favor, because you can obviously close out games fairly quickly as a mid-range deck. And Kroxa is like a way that you can invest a lot of that mana that you've accrued essentially over the course of a game. So while normally you're going to be stuck at like 1 or 2 mana, you know, we have like Ragavans and stuff to make treasure tokens. We have Fable the Mirrorbreaker. You have the token that will, when you attack, make treasure tokens. Also being able to discard 2 cards and draw 2 cards. Ends up fueling the Kroxa. Playing this out, you know, is not necessarily the most ideal thing to do because there's other 2-drops and stuff that you'd rather play. But with the different ways that you can kind of like discard it with like Fable the Mirrorbreaker, and just being able to kind of from there spend 4 mana, get it back. It's a 6/6. Again, you have, you know, these thought seizes, you have griefs and stuff. You can make a Kroxa stick around for a while, and it's going to end the game super quickly, and then put pressure on your opponent's hand of whatever cards they have left that don't deal with Kroxa, making it even harder for them to kind of claw back into a game. So definitely really neat. I mean, you could technically Not Dead After All and Undying Evil these. It's not going to work out very well, but you know, if you know that like you can kind of use them as like lightning bolts and stuff, like you could Not Dead After All, Undying Evil, Kroxa, and just kind of end up dealing a ton of damage to your opponent. I mean, with like, and especially with the Not Dead After All, you can just, it's easily, you know, force your opponent to discard a card, they lose 3 life, and then the Kroxa leaves, and they end up getting dealt like another point. You know, that's a potential for 7 points of damage for 3 mana, and that's a pretty good rate considering, you know, other burn decks and stuff like that. So again, not the most ideal. It's probably not going to come off very often with Kroxa being a one of, but that is an option that is afforded to you if you just want to like make your opponent discard a bunch of cards, and possibly even lose a ton of life as in the process as well. Of course, also being a mana sink for the later game, that for a threat that can usually close out pretty quickly. We have Orcish Bowmaster. Bowmaster is from the Lord of the Rings set. It's a 2 mana 1/1 flash when it enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, deals 1 damage to any target, and then you amass 1 orc. Essentially means that you get a 1/1 token when it enters, or 0/0 with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then every time that a Bowmaster would enter the battlefield, or that your opponent would draw a card except for the one they draw for the draw step, you're going to make an increasingly bigger orc. And this is essentially like a hate piece for people playing like the One Ring, people playing a bunch of cantrips. You know, we see from the Blue-Red Murktide deck, people are playing Preordain. They've kind of went back to playing some number of Ledger Shredder as well. So Bowmaster definitely has some of that utility, and even some of the other decks too that play Orcish Bowmaster, it has some pretty good utility and pretty good hate prowess, I guess, for essentially kind of keeping some of these decks in check, being able to offer a clock, and, you know, importantly putting pressure on your opponent. That's essentially like the kind of goal here. You know, Bowmaster, I think the ceiling on this is a little bit lower than something like Dauthi Voidwalker and like a Ragavan, but for what it does it very well. It's very powerful. It checks Ragavan very nicely, which is the best thing that you could ask for, honestly. So against those opposing decks, against opposing like 1 and 2 toughness creatures, Orcish Bowmaster along with like Ren and Sixes like slowly push them out. So Bowmaster just being a very good, very efficient hate piece for what it is. We went over Grief and Fury, kind of in our main focus on what the deck's trying to accomplish. The spells, honestly, pretty easy. You have Undying Evil, Not Dead After All as your ways to get back those evoke creatures and to even protect some of your other creatures, like Ragvan, Voidwalker, Bowmaster, etc. You have 1 Fatal Push, 2 Terminate as your removal options. Kind of easy to skimp on some of those when you are also playing 4 Fury in the deck. You have 4 Thoughtseize to round out your spells. We have said it time and time again on this channel. Thoughtseize is far and away one of the best discard spells. It has been far and away one of the best discard spells in Modern for a long time, and even in Pioneer and when it was in Standard. Nothing just beats Thoughtseize. The 2 life as like a drawback is only really a drawback when you have 2 life. Aside from that, Thoughtseize always just seems to be very, very good. There is very few situations where you do not want it. On top of it also being just a black card to pitch to Grief to like kind of wrap it all up. It's just a very good card. It's going to continue to see play, and of course, if for some reason you don't have like your Grief start or whatever, just again playing like a mid-range deck, playing Thoughtseize on turn 1, totally a viable option and definitely a good segue into some of your 2s and 3s going forward in this deck. Speaking of 3s, you have 6 enchantments and they're both 3 drops. Blood Moon is just a way that you can just win the game. If your opponent's not expecting Blood Moon, it's a little bit easier, I guess, to play around with some of the other top decks. You have Murktide, which plays like 3 islands in the deck and kind of wants to prioritize fetching some of those islands once it has like a Steam Vents or a Spirebluff Canal in play. You have the 4-color, 5-color Omnath decks, where before they would be able to kind of play around a Blood Moon with, the Yorion package and everything, but now without Yorion, they have their Delighted Halflings. They play, I think, 1 of like each basic. While they're not necessarily Blood Moon proof by any means, they definitely have a lot of tools to play around a Blood Moon. They kind of want to prioritize fetching a basic forest, when they can, because their Delighted Halflings and stuff just generate different kinds of colored mana to allow them to cast some of their 3 drops on curve and even go into their 4s and stuff. So while Blood Moon against some of the top decks is not necessarily game winning, it still warrants a spot because it's a lot of ways that you could just win a game that you probably weren't going to win in the first place. So definitely deserves at least a mention here. Even though I've just talked about it for probably way longer than anyone should talk about Blood Moon. This is terrible. Fable the Mirrorbreaker, we mentioned earlier, makes a 2/2 Goblin Shaman. Whenever it attacks, create a treasure token. Second chapter, you can discard up to 2 cards and draw that many cards. And then you can exile it, bring it back. And then it's, of course, a Kiki-Jiki on the back half that you have to pay 1 and tap to create a token of a non-legendary creature. Getting to create more Bowmaster, Dauthi Voidwalkers, even get to like Grief or Fury your opponent every single turn is kind of game breaking and honestly very hard for your opponent to get back into a game when you're able to draw step Grief them every turn and then eventually just be able to copy to make a Grief or a Fury and stuff on your turn to just kind of seal it all up from there. This card really just doesn't need any further explanation or justice done for it. It is a very powerful card. Fable the Mirrorbreaker has continued to see play in Modern as the format has went on. You keep seeing it in Pioneer as well. It has definitely warranted itself and is very powerful, and it just deserves whatever flowers that you want to give it as, a very powerful 3-drop in a format that efficiency is king, and getting to do very powerful things as early as possible are huge. Fable is definitely a way for this deck to, in a way, kind of catch up, even in a format with people playing for Orcish Bowmaster, getting to discard 2 cards and draw 2 cards, like you're able to just kind of answer, the things that Orcish Bowmaster is able to do, on top of just being very good and very flexible with the other creatures and stuff that you're playing in your deck to allow you to maximize the back half of this card as well as the front of it, which you kind of already do with some of these efficient spells, to say the least. The mana base, 20 lands, I would say pretty low, but I'm used to also playing like modern decks like back in the day where you'd play like 17, 18 lands and just a billion cantrips. So 20 lands in this deck, you're going to very often have like 1 and 2 land hands, which is kind of okay considering that your whole combo just needs a grief, a black card, and one of your undying effects. And obviously all it requires just 1 land to essentially play 5 mana worth of spells. So you have 3 Blackleaf Cliffs, comes into play tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. So as your 3rd land drop, it'll come into play untapped. And, from turn 4 onwards, normally it will come into play tapped if you hit your land drop every turn. You have 4 Delta, or 4 Mire, 4 Delta, and you have a Verdant Catacombs. You're playing 3 basic Swamp in the deck, obviously to kind of play around your own Blood Boon. So just having these fetch lands that all fetch black mana is, really nice, on top of your only other fetchable land being Blood Crypt. So if you need red mana, you are essentially priced into taking 3 damage. There's no basic mountain, but I'm sure that the times that comes up is not going to be huge, not having the basic mountain to be able to have 3 swamps in the deck to play around your own Blood Moon. Aside from that, there's only really 1 utility land, and that's the Takenuma Abandoned Mire. So it's 4 mana, discard it, and you mill 3 cards. You turn a creature a planeswalker, and it costs 1 less for each legendary creature that you have. I mean, you have 2 legendary creatures, technically a third one, or not even a third one. Reflection of Kiki-Jiki isn't even legendary. So you have 2 legendary creatures that you can play. You can make this cost 2. Whatever, you have some very powerful cards that you can get back with this Takenuma, and even if you pay full price for it, chances are you're going to be able to play any of these creatures that you'd be able to get back with the Takenuma on the next turn and everything. Sideboard, you have these Chalice of the Voids. Definitely a card that you bring in against the Cascade decks, but on top of it too, just getting to play it on 1 against some of the other super efficient decks in the format, like the Blue-Red Murktide decks. Just getting to put this on 1, even like against like Burn and stuff too. It's like some incidental hate there, where if you put it on 1, your opponent's going to have a very hard time, especially putting it on 1 on the draw or on the play against those kinds of decks. You have Engineer Explosives. You can play against like Rhinos, just kind of like a multi-purpose. And with the treasure tokens, you're actually able to tick this up past 2 counters. So if you need to go up to like 3 or 4, you definitely have the option to. But I feel like a lot of times, like Engineer Explosives is going to clear out like some dorks from the other side of like the 4 color, from like Yawgmoth and things like that. You have Fatal Push's additional removal. Pithing Needle as like a card that you normally see, I think, is like a one of in sideboards, but I think you see it a lot in like the decks playing Urza Saga. So the fact that this deck is not playing in Urza Saga or playing sagas in general, and you have a Pithing Needle in the sideboard, I think really speaks to kind of like what this, like the way that this deck wants to attack, and at what angle, and with the decent amount of filtering with like Fabled and Mirror Breaker, and of course a lot of the times like your hands maybe doing a little bit of nothing. Just having a Pithing Needle, having access to it is good enough. You have another Crocs on the sideboard, which we've kind of outlined, how good Crocs it can be in those late game situations. You have Terminate as additional removal, another Blood Moon because you just hate society and you just want to scream at people about not playing Magic, but then also stopping them from playing. You have Cooligan's Command is like this kind of grindy mid-range option, to buy back one of your creatures, put into your hand, force your opponent to discard a card. You have some tricks like in the draw step, where if your opponent draws a card, it's the only card in their hand, you can play this still in their draw step to get them to discard that card, and if it's not an instant, then they essentially like lose out on a turn. Destroying some problematic artifacts, Chalice on 1, in the matchups where your opponent decides to bring it in, in like kind of those grindier games, this can deal with it pretty easily, on top of just, having a bunch of utility when it comes to playing this deck. So Kolaghan's Command, only a one of, but a very good one of, a very classic one of for some red black base mid range decks. 3 Leyline of the Void, 2 Shielded the Apocalypse. Leyline of the Void, of course, just being turn 0 graveyard interaction, forcing your opponent to have some of their own enchantment removal. On top of you have a deck where you do have some number of looting effects. So if you end up drawing a Leyline of the Void, you can just pitch it. But you could also, in theory, draw or play like a Ragavan on turn 1 and eventually make enough treasures to cast a Leyline of the Void if you need to. Just something interesting to note. And of course, Shielded the Apocalypse, the 4-mana Praetor that everyone thought would suck and has silently become one of the most played in the format. Minus something like Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. I mean, you see Shielded everywhere, and like the decks that don't play Elesh Norn, they're playing Shielded. They're playing Shielded in 2, 3, 4 copies, where a lot of like the 4-color decks are playing like 1, maybe 2 copies of Elesh Norn. So definitely speaks to how powerful Shielded is. Unchecked, she can just win a game on her own. And of course, like when she starts attacking, it's a bad sign. It's kind of like that with like with Jason Mind Sculptor, where once your opponent stops brainstorming and they start +2ing, the game is virtually over. So when Shielded starts attacking, the game is virtually over in that sense. Like that is essentially the bridge from like mid 2010s to the almost mid 2020s is Shielded versus a 4-mana Planeswalker. So that is Rakdos Midrange. I definitely went for a lot longer than I thought I would, kind of explain this deck. Some important key things to note before we kind of transition to the end here, the true end, if you will. Rakdos Midrange is essentially an unfair deck, and arguably one of the most unfair things you could do on turn 1, with some pretty good consistency. Past that, it plays like a mid-range deck that is very resilient, depending on how many Not Dead After Alls and Undying Evils that you draw. Of course, we outlined a ton of different tricks and stuff that you could do with those cards to kind of maximize not only the value from them, but the creatures as well. They aren't actually, bad cards in like their own, like while typically they I don't think they would necessarily be like playable. The fact that they have the upside of just like making it so you just win a game on the spot, like your opponent just absolutely has no interaction for the rest of the game, on top of getting to get back Dauthi Voidwalkers after maybe you cast something, and then even getting to grow it to be able to get into more damage, getting to keep around Bowmaster to kind of hate out on the One Ring and hate out on cards like Ledger Shredder and Preordain and other kinds of cantrips. And as a mid-range deck, this deck does play very well, simply for the fact that it has tools for a little bit of everything. If your opponent's playing control, getting a Ragavan on board and just being able to create that mana advantage and getting to double spell as early as possible to make it harder on your opponent to kind of keep up with like their 1-for-1 and maybe some of their 2-for-1 in your favor stuff. Ends up being really good. Voidwalker against some of those other graveyard decks. We see it from Yawgmoth. We see it from the Living End decks. Dauthi Voidwalker definitely has a lot of utility. Comes down early enough in those matchups as well. And of course, in conjunction with like a Ragavan and stuff, you're going to put a quick clock on your opponent and you're going to hate them out on top of it and force them to answer this card while also with the Ragavan be able to play another 1-mana spell, maybe like a Thoughtseize or something, to then make sure that the Voidwalker is clear. Fable and Mirrorbreaker is essentially like the game breaker, if you will. If you get this flipped and you get to untap with it, if you have like even like a Dauthi Voidwalker or something like that, is totally fine, because then you're just going to cast whatever has void counters and play whatever has void counters from exile like every turn for essentially 1 mana. And if your opponent's got something good, and you're able to just keep rebuying it, because of course whatever you play, if it's like an instant or sorcery, it's just going to go right back into exile with that counter on it, and you're going to be able to cast it again that turn with the Dauthi Voidwalker that you have. Or and then the next turn if it's summoning sick and whatnot. So yeah, that is the Rakdos mid-range deck for the modern format. I hope you all enjoyed the definitely longer form video. Of course, if you like this video and you want to see more stuff like this, you want to see more content from my channel, please consider subscribing, ring the notification bell, join the Discord server, all that fun stuff. We're almost at 250, and that was kind of my goal for the year, and we have crushed September. Hoping to keep it going. Maybe we can hit 300 by the end of the year. Honestly, we kind of have like that momentum and trending towards that. So kind of help me get to that goal. Please subscribe, ring notification bell, all that fun stuff. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.